Melodrama is a literary genre that began in the 19th century in England and France. It is a genre that really prides itself on exaggeration, right, of creating a relationship between the reader and the characters in that specific text, right? They were often serialized in newspapers, the different stories. And one of the defining characteristics is this Manichaean way of looking at the world, right? So you had good characters, you had bad characters, you had, honor and dishonor, you had morality, immorality, right? And whoever read them knew exactly who to root for, right? And so it was a very popular genre. It then later turned into radio dramas in the early time of radio, and then that transferred into or translated itself into cinema, and then the most recent manifestation, which is telenovela in Latin America. I'm going to switch over to the definition to talk about it in terms of telenovelas or soap operas, right? Which the soap operas in the US and telenovelas are related, obviously, because their foundation is this melodrama, the genre of melodrama. But in Latin America, it's very, very different. As I mentioned during my talk, telenovelas are very popular, right? They're shown during primetime slots. Reruns come out throughout the day. Some of them are remade constantly, right? Every generation has a certain telenovelas that show up. And one of the key differences is that in the US, soap operas, at least the ones that remain, right? I think there's only 2 left, Days of Our Lives, and I can't remember the other one. I think it might be General Hospital. Those are never ending, right? Those go on for 30 years. Different characters come in, different storylines get added. Whereas in Latin America, the telenovela is a very short serial. So it's usually between 100 and 160 episodes. There's a clear protagonist, there's a clear antagonist. There's usually 1 or 2 main plots and then a few subplots, but you know exactly who to focus in on throughout the story. And there is a resolution, right? And then the next one starts. So I think that's one of the more defining characteristics of telenovela versus US soap operas. The body of scholarship around telenovelas is vast and wide, and there are some scholars who, at least at the beginning, definitely say, well, it's frivolous, it's only something that women watch, all these gossipy stories, right, these cliched characters. But as the research continued, it became very evident that actually, no, it's not just women who watch these, right? It's not just bored housewives who pay attention to these stories. And since the beginning, telenovelas have definitely talked about social issues. In Brazil, for example, some of the first telenovelas that talked about social issues came out of Brazil. So, for example, some soap operas in Brazil talk about the colonial history of slavery, right, in Brazil, and why you have this weird hierarchy socially in the country. You have some that talk about current racial inequality in Brazil. In Mexico, you've had, and Brazil and Mexico are the 2 main centers where telenovelas are produced. Colombia is getting there, but not quite at this point. In Mexico, there have been telenovelas that talk about interracial relationships, for example, HIV/AIDS, homosexuality, government corruption. And so this new iteration of telenovelas that have to do with drug violence is just in keeping with this long tradition of telenovelas that deal with social issues. Don't get me wrong, there are still the ones that follow, the young woman who comes from the countryside and falls in love with the rich man's son, but there's a subgenre that definitely deals with social issues. One way to answer your question is, again, going back to perhaps veiled critique that I was making of capitalism, right? The fact that these drug lords are basically businessmen who are just illegitimate businessmen, right? And I say that, you know, understanding what I'm getting myself into when I say that. But in terms of the fact that these are people, these are men who run businesses, illicit businesses, and often, as I was saying earlier, what they do for their local communities is to step in often to provide social services that the government, either local, national, or state, doesn't have money for or just doesn't do for whatever reason, right? So you mentioned Pablo Escobar, and he built schools, for example, right? He would use kids from the local barrios to be lookouts and pay them money. In Mexico, you have cartels establishing order in towns where perhaps, you know, you had petty crime running rampant. And so again, there's a sense of authoritarianism that I think these men embody, number one. And number two, as I mentioned in my talk, they really do represent this anti-hero figure, this Robin Hood taking from the rich, distributing to the poor, that I think is very appealing to a lot of different people. And right, as much as we say that we don't admire them, the fact that they can make it onto the Forbes, you know, list of billionaires, I think says a lot about how much certain societies value money, regardless of how you make it. It is so hard to know what is true and what is false, okay, in these stories, right? So you have these women being arrested, being charged with, you know, gun possession, whatever it may be, and they deny it, get sent to prison, and then charges are dropped, right? So is their denying the story true, or was the government's official version of their story true? So I think that what you see happening is not that they influence it, not that news stories influence these novels and vice versa, but I think that there is this connection between these true-to-life stories that easily turn into fiction, right? And fiction, and it's sort of like you can't make these stories up, right? But they're so hard to believe because how would you imagine a 23-year-old, you know, woman who won a beauty pageant to all of a sudden be arrested for drug trafficking, right? So there's almost this fantastic element to these stories, and I think both news accounts and novels really, really, I don't want to say exploit because that's too negative, but that's the only word that comes to mind right now. The spectacle of it all, right? And this attraction of the audience to the stories, right? And taking advantage of just these really, really fascinating characters, both fictional and real. Generally speaking, in traditional narratives of narco novels, the songs, they're usually secondary figures, right? Secondary characters or objects. They're the girlfriend of, the wife of, the sister of. And often in these traditional stories, they are almost trophies, right, to be fought over. A lot of the early fights between cartels, some say, again, there's so much that's true, so much that is sort of these stories, these myths that come about, that some of the first fights between cartels were because of a fight over a woman, right? Sort of this Helen of Troy, you know, the fight between the Greeks and the Trojans is attributed to one poor woman who had nothing to say about that fight. And I think that that's why the texts that I'm talking about are so different, is because they kind of exist in a tension between this traditional portrayal, but also kind of challenging that traditional portrayal by kind of questioning the traditional gender roles of women in Mexico. an interest on the part of the Mexican authorities to say, hey, look, we caught this, drug trafficker, this woman drug trafficker, so that they could sort of say that what they were doing to combat the violence was actually working, right? So I think one of the reasons why her story was so much in the press is because it was a deliberate effort on the part of the government to make sure that the public knew that they were doing their job, right? Laura Zuniga, I think, was a little bit different because she, in the grand scheme of the drug trade, she is a minor player. $60,000 is chump change when you think about it, right? But I think in her case, the story was much more talked about, again, because she was a beauty queen, right? She was very pretty. She looked very, very sad in her, perp walk and the whole thing. So I think that was the part that was much more intriguing for the public, right? Now, as far as who continues to have importance, I would say it's more Sandra Avila Beltran, because she continues to be interviewed even after having been released from prison. And even while she was in prison, all these stories came out about, as I mentioned during my talk, the fact that she would have outfits brought in from the outside, so she would always look nice, that she would get her hair done while she was in prison. So there's all these stories even while she was sort of out of the public eye, more so than with Laura. I think films like Miss Bala and novels, other novels, not La Reina del Sur, but others that have come out, are really trying to be a little bit more nuanced in the way that they talk about the people involved, right? And I'm not saying that they're trying to be sympathetic to drug cartels in any way, shape, or form, but what I'm saying is that they're trying to at least contextualize people's behavior, people's motivations, and their stories.